The Clown of Unit 7. The storm was raging that night when Martin arrived for the night shift at San Gabriel Hospital. It was an old building with long hallways and high ceilings that amplified every echo. As a nurse, he had worked in many places, but this hospital had always seemed strange to him. The first thing he noticed when he entered was the smell, a faint aroma of humidity and disinfectant mixed with something else, something sweet. Too sweet. "Do you smell that?" he asked his colleague Sophia, another nurse. "Yes, but I don't want to know what it is," she replied with a nervous smile. "You know what they say about this hospital, right?" Martin raised an eyebrow. "What do they say?" "That there was a fire here in Unit 7 10 years ago. All the patients died, including some children who were in pediatrics. Since then, some say they have seen things." Martin snorted, trying to downplay it. Strange things happen in every hospital. But there was something in Sophia's tone that made him uneasy. The laughter in the dark. Around midnight, Martin walked down the third-floor hallway checking rooms. Most of the patients were asleep, except for a few who murmured in their sleep. That was when he heard it. A laugh. Light, distant, almost childish but distorted. The sound came from the end of the hallway right where Unit 7 used to be, now closed. Martin swallowed and moved forward cautiously. The lights flickered slightly. When he got there, he saw something that made him stop dead. The door to Unit 7 was ajar. Impossible, he thought. That door had been sealed with boards. He slowly pushed the door open and a cold draft enveloped him. Inside, the walls were covered in soot and mold. The only light came from a flickering lamp on the ceiling. In the middle of the room there was something lying on the floor. Martin approached it, his heart pounding. It was a bright, inflated red balloon. And next to it a huge shoe. A clown shoe. The children of Unit 7. A dry noise resounded behind Martin. Someone was there. He turned suddenly and saw several small figures standing in the darkness. Children. Or at least shadows shaped like children. They had no faces, just dark silhouettes, and they stared at him. Martin felt a chill run down his spine. "Can they talk?" he asked in a trembling voice. One of the children raised his hand and pointed behind him. Martin slowly turned his head and saw, a few meters away, a tall figure. A man. No, a clown. He was wearing a dirty, torn suit. His skin was white as paper and he had a huge smile painted on his face. But his eyes were completely black. The clown bowed his head and then ran towards Martin with inhuman speed. Martin ran out of the place, panting. He slammed the door shut and leaned against it, feeling something hitting from the other side. The lost file. When he reached the nurse's station, he tried to explain to Sophia what he had seen, but she looked at him in disbelief. "A clown? Are you sure it wasn't a disoriented patient?" But then another nurse, Carla, approached with a pale face. "Martin, I just found something in the hospital files. You have to see this." She opened an old file covered in dust and showed it to him. It was the record of a man named Adrian Funes, a children's entertainer known as Rhesus, who worked in the hospital's pediatrics until the fire. "They say he caused the fire," Carla whispered. "That he had an unhealthy obsession with children. When they found out he scared them and locked them in at night, they tried to fire him, but he went crazy. He locked the doors and set the entire wing on fire." Martin felt the blood drain from his face. "That means?" "Yes," Carla said, her voice shaking. "That clown you saw, he's not a patient. He's him." The last shift. That same night, Martin decided not to set foot in Unit 7 again. But before he left, he passed by the room of an elderly patient, Mr. Ramirez. "Martin?" the man whispered in a weak voice. "Don't go near him." Martin froze. "Oh." The old man stared at him and muttered, "Risa." He never left. Martin felt the air getting heavier. He looked at the patient's heart monitor and noticed that the line began to fluctuate strangely. And then, on the screen, a smiley face appeared. Martin walked out of the room, his heart racing. He knew he would never work at that hospital again. And as he left the building, just before he got into his car, he saw a red balloon floating in the driveway. And behind him, in the third-floor window, a figure with a wide, dark smile was watching him. The clown's mirror. Mateo was never afraid of clowns. As a child, he even found them funny with their red noses and huge shoes. But everything changed the night he visited his Aunt Helena's house. The house was old, with dark wood furniture and long hallways. His aunt collected antiques, and among them was something that caught Mateo's eye, a huge gold mirror in the main hallway. The strange thing wasn't the mirror itself, but the reflection. When Mateo walked past it, he noticed something strange. The reflection was slightly delayed. At first he thought it was his imagination, but when he looked again he saw something that made him freeze. There was someone else in the mirror. The clown in the reflection. He approached cautiously. Behind his reflection, in the shadows, a tall, thin figure could be seen. A clown. He had a white suit with faded colored spots and a tilted hat. His face was painted with a grin that was too wide and big dark eyes that stared at him. Matteo turned around suddenly, but the hallway was empty. He looked at the mirror again and saw that the clown was closer. He felt a chill run down his spine and decided to walk away. "It's just my imagination," he whispered. But when he turned off the lights in the hallway before going to his room, he swore he heard a faint chuckle coming from the mirror. "Don't look too hard." That night, Matteo couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in bed, feeling like someone was watching him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the clown's face. He decided to get up for a glass of water. He carefully went down the stairs and passed through the hallway where the mirror was. He didn't want to look, but something inside him forced him to. The reflection looked back at him, but something was wrong. It wasn't him. The reflection moved with a slight delay and his expression didn't match. He was smiling. Matteo stepped back, feeling his chest tighten with fear. Suddenly, the clown's reflection appeared right behind his reflection, his mouth stretching wider and wider into an impossible smile. The clown's eyes stared at him and the light in the hallway flickered. When he returned to normal, the clown was no longer in the mirror. The smile in the darkness. The air became heavy. Matteo felt something surrounding him. He wasn't alone. He heard a faint laugh in his ear. His breathing quickened and he ran upstairs, slamming the door to his room shut. He got under the covers and tried to convince himself that it was just a nightmare. But then he felt something cold on his hand. Something soft. Something like a clown glove. He snapped his eyes open and saw a figure standing next to his bed. The clown was there. Outside the mirror. The last thing Matteo heard before everything went black was the same muffled laughter, louder, closer. The empty house. The next morning, his Aunt Helena found the room empty. Matteo had disappeared. The only thing left on the bed was a white glove stained red. And when Helena passed by the mirror for an instant, she swore she saw her nephew in the reflection, with a smile too wide on his face. Since then, every night, the mirror shows a silhouette in the dark. And if you look too long, maybe the clown will come looking for you too. The clown in the trunk. When Adrian was 8 years old, his grandfather gave him an old wooden trunk. "It was from an old circus," he said with a smile. "Maybe you'll find something interesting inside." The trunk was huge, with worn gold trim and a rusty lock. It smelled damp and dusty. Adrian, excited, opened it without hesitation. There was only one thing inside. A clown's suit. It was red and yellow with white ruffles at the collar and wrists. It had a rubber nose and a pair of white gloves. But what caught his attention the most was the mask. It was made of porcelain, with an exaggerated smile painted in red and blue eyes so bright they looked real. His grandfather looked at him with nostalgia. "That suit belonged to Tito Rositas," he said. "A famous clown from the 1950s. But he mysteriously disappeared one night in the middle of a show. They never found his body, just his clothes inside that trunk." Adrian swallowed. Something about that story didn't sit well with him. But he still left the trunk in his room. He shouldn't be afraid, it was just a costume, right? The laughter in the night. That night, Adrian had a strange dream. He was in a circus tent, surrounded by a laughing and applauding audience. In the center of the ring, a clown was spinning and dancing. Tito Rositas. But when Adrian tried to move, he realized he couldn't. He was inside the clown. He looked at his hands and saw the white gloves. The trunk's costume. He tried to scream, but all that came out of his mouth was a chilling laugh. He woke up suddenly, gasping. His room was in darkness, lit only by the street light. And then he heard it. A faint sound of laughter. It came from the trunk. Adrian shuddered. The lid was ajar, and he swore he had closed it before he went to sleep. He stood up, shaking, and slammed it shut. But when he turned back to the bed, he saw something that left him breathless. The mask was on his pillow. The mirror doesn't lie. The next morning, Adrian asked his grandfather to take the trunk away. But the old man just smiled. "What? It's just a costume, Adrian. There's nothing wrong with it." Adrian insisted, but his grandfather ignored him. That night, he decided to put the costume in the trunk and make sure it didn't get out. He placed chairs and books on top of the lid. But at midnight, something woke him up. The trunk was open, and the costume was gone. Adrian felt a chill and looked at the mirror in his closet. His reflection was there, but it didn't look right. There was something behind him. Two blue eyes shone in the darkness, and a pale face with a grotesque smile watched him from the mirror. It was Tito Rositas. The reflection slowly raised a hand and gestured for him to come closer. The last laugh. Adrian couldn't move. The clown in the mirror started laughing, first softly, then louder, harder. Suddenly, a gloved hand came out of the mirror and grabbed his arm. Adrian screamed. He felt himself being pulled towards the glass, his skin turned cold, his vision blurred. The last thing he saw was his room receding as laughter filled his mind. When his grandfather entered the room in the morning, the mirror was broken. The trunk, empty. And on the bed, only Tito Rosita's mask remained, waiting for its next owner. If you ever find an old circus trunk, don't open it. You never know who might be waiting inside.